Hello, everyone, and welcome to a brand new podcast called CryptoScam. And on this podcast, we will try to break down all of the tokens in the crypto space, along with a lot of other projects. We will talk about what we like about these projects, what we don't like about these projects. And we are kicking off this series, of course, with the one with the highest market cap, which is Bitcoin. And my co-host for this episode today is none other than Chris DeRose, who has occasionally been a fellow skeptic of Bitcoin, and we will explore why that is. So Chris, go ahead and introduce yourself and what makes you a little bit of an expert in this space.
What's up, party people? Tone Vase is wonderful. He told me about this series, and I was honored not only to be included, but to be in the very first episode covering the very best cryptocurrency, at least in my opinion, Bitcoin. So it's certainly also the most controversial. Seems hard to believe in the year 2017, but we've gone through a lot. And yeah, I love Bitcoin as much as anybody, but there's a lot to be skeptical of. And I think that it's really important that we understand the criticism in this space as equally as we understand the benefits of these solutions in order to really frame a better understanding for all of the other projects and comparatively analyze what they all offer and how they all differ. So I guess let's get started.
Let's get started. Oh, also, we are at the Miami Bitcoin Hackathon. We are shooting from the Miami Bitcoin Hackathon, so it might be a little noise in the background, but hey, this is Bitcoin. This is what we have to work with. And so today's episode, we're going to focus on three things for all these projects. We're going to talk about how it got started, its current use cases, and what we think the future holds, and the value propositions. So let's go ahead and start with Bitcoin, and we'll take it from the very beginning. A lot of people say that when they have a token, they're saying, well, if our token is problematic, well, so is Bitcoin. If we're a scam, then Bitcoin is a scam. And they always point to the way Satoshi launched his Bitcoin. Launched the first Genesis block, where he mined the first Genesis block and got a lot of the coins. And also, very few people knew about that Genesis block. I believe he used, he did have a mass email out to a select group of people. And Chris, you've been in Bitcoin longer than me. And was this problematic? Is this a problem? And let's talk about that.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think the very first thing you have to consider is that nobody's launched a cryptocurrency before as of the year 2009, 8, depending on how you want to count it. And so there wasn't any path to success or any sort of precedent that you could draw from. So the way that Satoshi did it was in that vacuum. And while I think it's easy to look back now and to say that there are better or worse ways to have done things, there was just no knowledge back then. And I think too, for all of these projects in this space, you have to decide what the reach is. And back then, I think Satoshi's angle was more of a sort of trepidatious, like, yes, this is a big goal, but also let's give it a try. Whereas I think today it's more like we've done this before, we know how, and we are centralized teams that are going to successfully pull this off. So I think that level of uncertainty was both announced, and I don't think it was even wanted. I think Satoshi wanted people to come to the project on day one so we could hand it right off to them and disappear, which is, as evidenced by what happened, is what happened. You can say that like Bitcoin was the same, but what's very problematic for you when you say that is the actions of Satoshi both before and after. It's not like he sold any of these for a profit. For all we know, he stored away the private keys.
So just to follow up on that, and I'm also thinking the same thing. People say it's unfair that Satoshi mined all of those coins early on. And my general argument to that is, yeah, but they weren't valuable, and he didn't know they were going to be valuable. It's not like he's not a prophet to know that where Bitcoin would go from there. He was hoping that it would go there. But people are like, well, I wasn't around. I didn't get a chance to mine it. Yeah, because even he probably didn't think it would get to this level. And people like hold him accountable and saying, I can launch my coin more fairly. And to me, that's a bit of an issue. And in the early days of Bitcoin, and you referred to this concept on your podcast, which is also great, by the way, a little plug for Bitcoin Uncensored. And a concept of a natural Ponzi. Can you define that for people? And
Absolutely.
Was Bitcoin, or is Bitcoin still a natural Ponzi?
Well, I mean, this does even go back to that question of the issuance. So what I see in Bitcoin is what has been described by a number of people, but the World Economic Forum, I believe, or the World Bank at the least, as a natural Ponzi. And Ponzi's can be defined in a number of ways, but the best way, I think, and the way that most people define them, is a scheme in which the early investors are paid off by later investors. So by that definition, a lot of things are on the Ponzi spectrum. Gold is the sort of quintessential natural Ponzi example. Stock options are often very Ponzi-ish. Even a lot of purely speculative investments are very Ponzi-like. I think in the case of Bitcoin, what's important is it was a natural Ponzi. And I believe that, at least in the beginning. It was a natural Ponzi, if only because Satoshi disappeared and he left. And at that point, the thing ran itself without a center of control. That's very different than a lot of the other projects where it is a centralized Ponzi. In sort of the Ethereum sense, there's a team, and we are going to control this Ponzi, and we are the leaders who will guide you through this Ponzi. I think that was a very key difference in the issuance of Bitcoin and in the structure of Bitcoin today. One that I think only Monero is the project that's maybe even remotely similar in that respect, at least off the top of my head.
Oh, and for these projects, we will get to Monero. This series will include Monero. It will include Ethereum. I will try to do them in order of market cap, but also as quality co-hosts become available, we will go through each one of these tokens, and we will provide the audience of some information throughout the beginning, middle, and end of the token. Okay, so another concept that comes up in Bitcoin, and I'm hearing it a little more so these days, is that Satoshi got the economic model perfectly right with his deflation mechanism, and the way Bitcoin halves every 4 years was perfect. And what I've been trying to explain to people, it's not that he perfectly designed the economics from the beginning, which one day I'm hoping he will get the Nobel Prize for. It's just that because Bitcoin had 2 years to spread around the world without any actual monetary value assigned to it, minus the pizzas, and it allowed the world to adjust to the Satoshi's economic model. So it's not that he got it perfectly right, it's just the usage of Bitcoin adjusted to what he did and the deflation rate, which is creating this illusion of this prophet-like God status that he knows economics better than anyone else. And what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, the issuance rate is different than the inflation rate, at least for me. There's a lot of arguments here. Inflation typically is not as simple as the issuance rate because you have things like people moving in and out of the system. You have various price fluctuations by which the per capita expense, the per capita allocation of Bitcoin changes independent of the issuance rate. And you see that every time the price goes up and down in a way that is not directly correlated to the mathematical inflation rate. So are we talking about the mathematical inflation rate or the monetary inflation rate then?
Well, no, the coin distribution, like the fact,
the issuance, yeah,
and the fact that he left it on a 21 million cap.
I personally, one of my concerns about Bitcoin is that the inflation was geared a bit too much to the early adopters. I think right now we are at how many years in? 8 years in, and 75% of the supply has been allocated. So that puts a lot of pressure, and this is part of the block size debate, but that puts a lot of pressure on miners to be securing greater tips at a time when I don't know that we really are able to. I don't think that it was in any stretch perfect, but what I do think is that it was at least good enough. And, you know, in this series, I don't know where you're going to take this, but one of the things I think is very important is the depth of the markets and the liquidity of these markets. So when you look at Bitcoin, maybe it wasn't perfect, but maybe the market itself can absorb that imperfection in a way that makes it less problematic due to the size of that market. So we know what the issuance rates are going to be, and the market's large enough, I think, to keep at least monetary levels of inflation relatively steady, perhaps as a result. The depth of that market is greater. So I don't know if that's going to, in the long term, be as relevant in the context of tips. That's a big part of what the sort of block size segue controversies are trying to address.
Yeah, I might get into that in a future episode where we will do one of these episodes specifically for Bitcoin Unlimited and maybe one for Segwit as well. But onto that topic, right? When you say, well, perhaps Satoshi did not pick the proper issuance rate. And my view is because Bitcoin was first and it got to, this is my big point. Yes, it was geared to early adopters, but because in the early days it was valueless, it was able to spread around the world fairly evenly. Yes, there are people like Roger Ver and a few others that saw the value proposition early and held on to a lot of their coins. But those people are few and far between, and slowly this will also go back into the economy. My view is that no matter what cap Satoshi picked, and no matter what where when he picked those halvings, the market would have adjusted to his numbers and not the other way around.
Yeah.
And because he had a 2-year head start, it went a long way. So
yeah, I do think that if we're on this subject, what I would probably say is, and this is my sort of opinion, if it were me, I think that the halving of 2 years is probably a bit too long. And I also think that
4 years.
Sorry, 4 years. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, I would have probably. Yeah, I would have seen that a significantly more condensed schedule. I don't think
really.
I think so. I think in part because of the level of stress and the level. I think that he himself probably found those halvings to be like a very stressful occasion. There's no precedent. There's no data for what would happen. So I think he kind of decided to take those out. I would have said, for me, 6 months or something like that, probably. But I also think that the rates at which it was issued are probably, it would be nice to see like 25 or 50%, I think, of the issuance having been allocated at this point in 2017. But I don't know how to really quantify that. So that's just my gut feeling.
Okay, so what about this concept? And it's funny, I was a big gold bug. I was a big libertarian. Then you come to Bitcoin and turns the whole world around. We're not going to get into that concept. But occasionally I've been very criticized for the following. And I'm not saying I want this. I'm more saying that I wouldn't fight against this. Like, for example, the U.S. government produces a certain number of paper bills. The U.S. government wants, let's say, $1 billion worth of paper currency in circulation. And they have fairly good models to estimate how often these paper currencies get destroyed. A person's house burns down, things like that. They get worn out. You can have a decent estimate of how many of these were destroyed. Bitcoin has a similar problem. Satoshi meant to have 21 million coins in circulation, but we know already that my guess is about 10% have been destroyed from early spreading it around. So my view is if the U.S. government wants $1 billion of currency in circulation, they do their best job to replace the ones that have been destroyed. What do you think about an idea that, let's say in 20, 30 years, when the mining subsidy is under 1 Bitcoin, that someone comes up with a fairly good formula to estimate, this coin hasn't moved for 30 years. It is most likely lost. Can we slowly, at like a quarter of a Bitcoin per block, put that back in to kind of have a mathematical average of 21 million Bitcoins in circulation forever? What do you think of that concept?
I'm not a fan of that. I think that breaks the community promise at this point. Like, that might have been something that could have been discussed on day one, but I think that now anybody making that change would be destroying the community faith in doing so. And I think that the effects of that decision would be detrimental to I guess, just the faith in Bitcoin. But the other thing too is
that when the mining subsidy is running low, do you think the view on that might change?
I don't think so. Because here's the other component I would say too, is that the market cap is more important than the token numbers for a lot of these things. So like, again, because we have subdivisions down to the 8th degree, we can very easily transmit values that are not like contingent upon the number of tokens. So like, all that would happen in that model is that the market would probably accommodate it for it at a level that the market cap was still the same regardless. And I think all you would end up doing would be affecting the faith in the system now that you've established a precedent for creating monetary supply decisions, which has never been done since the start. And which, by the way, were part of the reason I think that even a lot of the project's goals were communicated as a mechanism for sort of defeating the bankers and their arbitrariness in making decisions.
Agreed. All right, so one more point to make on the origins of Bitcoin, and I hear this a lot. And it's with the fact that Satoshi is anonymous. And is it possible that this was a Trojan horse from the beginning to get, starting off with the libertarians that hate the government, to get them on a digital value transfer system and get them to help eliminate the cash? And then like the government or the NSA that was really behind this project, and now that this project helped them with this movement, eliminate the cash, and now bam, this is a Trojan horse for the government to get us all on a very trackable digital currency system. Is that is a criticism of the scam of Bitcoin. How valid is that criticism?
I don't see that. I mean, the conspiracy theories can go on forever, and I very famously like to label these things conspiracy theories. It's an unfalsifiable claim, which makes it very non-scientific and largely uninteresting to me. I'd be highly skeptical of it. The magnitude of that conspiracy would be enormous, and I don't really see that the detrimental parts of Bitcoin could be explained in such a capacity. You know, the governments across the world are like dealing with some very difficult things as a result of Bitcoin, or that they will. And for better and worse, I mean, that is to suggest that it's a Trojan horse in such a way that it is also now causing capital flight in China and various forms of like income tax circumvention across the world. Like it just seems to me that like it's just too complex and weird for that to have any merit.
Yeah, no, and I agree with that. And what people have to realize is, last I heard, 80% of Satoshi's original code has really been rewritten.
Yeah.
And the other 20% has been very scrutinized to make sure that the reason it hasn't been rewritten is because it's working the way it should.
Yeah, well, the other thing to say too is that like Satoshi, you gotta remember the time. Satoshi Nakamoto, as a phenomenon, was an anonymous person who were very much motivated by the chancellor bailing out the banks. So like the level of the conspiracy would have to be such that they created this sort of like Robin Hood figure as part of this conspiracy. Now the whole thing is just like, at some point you have to say like, well, does the line connect between A and B? It was just an anonymous person who had strong feelings, or does it go across this gigantic, like where's the simpler path? Because I think that's just like very easy story from, you know, what was presented to like what was accomplished, as opposed to going through a Rube Goldberg machine whereby like government agents are having the craziest of incentives to get from A to B. That's what it seems like to me. I take the Occam's razor approach.
No, I agree with you 100% on that. That's why I haven't really been commenting all that much. I don't have any additional viewpoints. But one more point on the origin. Is it possible for Satoshi to now reappear and take control of the project at this point in time? Do you think that is an attack vector for Bitcoin and that we were all scammed from the start?
Well, what a lot of people don't realize is the importance of proof of work. Proof of work is, in fact, a system by which objective truth is declared regardless of an attestation. The Genesis block itself was an attestation, and that's fine. There was no work that went into that. You can start your own Genesis block if you will, but what is certain is that every single block that's been appended to that first block has more and more energy that went into it. Until now, what we have is a record of truth that is independent of the creator in full, and you see these other projects that are starting Genesis blocks, you know, Ethereum or whatnot. Certainly, the proof of stake blocks are very much started by the individuals, but I think that it defies the knowledge of what a blockchain is, and that blockchain is a record of truth relative to the economic capital burnt to assert that truth. So, could Satoshi show up? Sure. Could he take control of the blockchain? Absolutely. And we know how much energy it would take to do that. And he will not have those resources, nor will anybody have those resources, because it's almost a decade's worth of energy being burned by thousands of computers across the world. It's just kind of an asinine claim at this point. There's nothing about Satoshi that's needed.
Okay, so what about the concept of, if he is in control of, let's say, 1 billion coins, can he use that leverage when the price of Bitcoin goes so high and he's like the first world trillionaire? Is there anything, I mean, my view was, why would he want to now destroy the project that he's built? But some people are worried that he would be able to use that leverage of being the richest man in the world to mess with the world.
So that's really a very interesting question. And I don't think that anybody has a great answer. But what I will say is that a lot of the information right now in the market would suggest that Satoshi isn't moving his coins. Certainly not anytime soon. If Satoshi moved a single Satoshi of value in one of those locked up accounts, the price would probably tank, as this would be an indicator to the market that that value is in fact actively managed. Now, what does that mean for Bitcoin as a whole? Well, the price would reflect that new information. Price discovery would go crazy for a little while. Maybe the price of Bitcoin will be $1. Maybe it'll be 10 cents. I don't really know. It's a great question. But what I will say is that the price would be negatively affected. I think that no one would really benefit from that. Certainly, Satoshi himself wouldn't benefit from that. Those coins, I think, are almost unspendable at this point, because moving them is going to crash it, and nobody benefits.
I can do a counter argument to that. There is a way, if he does come back and he publicly announced that he is interested in putting those coins back into circulation, and he wants to do it in the least disruptive way. And there is two ways I can see him doing that. He can contribute X amount of those coins to the next found block as an additional mining reward. Or he can also start slowly distributing these coins to, let's say, charities, basically as an announcement. And he would also like provide publicly, this is the rate at which I'm going to put these coins into circulation. Or he can even like request community, like a poll from the community, at what rate do people think that it would have the least amount of effect, and then slowly put those coins back into circulation in some kind of a fair way.
That's fine, and I don't know that that's necessarily bad. But what I will say is that I think currently the price reflects the monetary supply as having those coins out of commission. So even if he's giving them to charity, that in effect increases their usable supply. So the relative value of your holdings will be lower, and I think the price would reflect that. So even if it's going to a good cause, and even if it's controlled by a good person. Now, the other part of that too is we now have to assess the risk of Satoshi lying to us, which may be very low or may be very high. Traders can make that distinction. But you don't, even though he says it, you don't know that that's the case. You don't even know if it's Satoshi. It could be somebody that controlled the Satoshi keys. So,
or it could be a key that we think is Satoshi but isn't.
Right. Absolutely. So
the market will need to assess that risk at the time.
And that's the Craig Wright component even at some level.
But I actually don't think that the price reflects that Satoshi will never spend those coins again. I don't think
you're right.
I don't think it does yet. I think there is still enough skepticism that Satoshi may come back and spend those coins.
I think
and it could be one of the reasons holding down the price today.
It certainly is. I mean, here's the thing: is there's a risk, and I believe that markets reflect that risk. So it's hard to really decouple that component of the risk from the price. But some percentage, maybe it's 80% of the support or 20% of the support, believes that Satoshi will or won't spend those coins. But what is certain is that to the degree that that support is available, it will be removed the second those coins are spent. So we will find out at that point how much of the price reflected that risk.
All right. No, it's very good. All right, so let's jump on the current state of Bitcoin, and let's talk about the actual network effect and how Bitcoin is able to pull off this circular economy that we have today with Bitcoin. And do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, in all of the space, the size of the Bitcoin network is measured by market cap, liquidity, transactions, et cetera. It is enormously larger than all of the other coins, and the network effect, I think, is extremely important. In fact, it may be the only thing that's important. Currencies are faith-based. When you hold an IOU from like the federal government of America versus an IOU from the European Union versus an ounce of gold, a big part of that risk assessment is the degree to which you can give this to the next person and have them believe it. So for me, I see the first mover as being the most important part of this space, and all the numbers really reflect that. I mean, you look at all of the markets; they are pegged to Bitcoin. Bitcoin's price seems to abut the dollar, or at least I believe it abuts the dollar. And then every cryptocurrency appears to abut Bitcoin. So if Bitcoin's down, Monero's down generally, Ethereum's down, Ripple's down. At some level, I think that's true, and a large one.
No, that's actually what we have seen. But in addition to that, the way I see it is there was so much effort put in to Bitcoin. We have all these Bitcoin ATM machines. We have all this infrastructure surrounded for Bitcoin. So it's not, people always like to say that, well, another coin can't take over for Bitcoin like Facebook took over for MySpace. And I think the economics behind it are way more difficult to do something like that because there's just so much investment has already gone into Bitcoin. And this is the last community you want to lose. And this community is invested to making sure it's Bitcoin that that continues to go up.
I was part of the mania from 2011 to now, and it was a mania, especially between 2011 to the 2013 years.
I was part of the 2013 mania.
And I find it extremely hard to believe here in 2017 that we would see a repeat of that mania. I think that we've never seen a blockchain before. We've never seen bearer assets on the internet before. And wealthy people, poor people, ideological people all open up their wallets to invest in this amazing new technology. And now here we are, and we have blockchain for almost a decade. And it's hard for me to think that we will see a repeat of that enthusiasm with the degree of financial commitment that we saw in those years. So when people come to me and they say that their coin is going to, exceed or even match Bitcoin's success, I just don't see it happening. I can't imagine wanting to do this again. Like, I'm doing Bitcoin. I'm not doing the next pump. I don't really care enough. I've only got this in me to do it once. If Bitcoin fails, I think a lot of us will take our balls and go home. So I'm very skeptical that another coin will come and match the mania that we saw for the world's first blockchain.
Well, my view is that we're not just we're gonna take our speculative balls and go home.
Yep, right.
But if Bitcoin is on the way down, like this is my view. It's like I'm not gonna guess which of the 700 coins is gonna replace Bitcoin. And if I was wrong on the speculative value of Bitcoin, all that means is I will not be rich when Bitcoin hits $10, $20, $30,000 a coin. But if something does prove itself, I will use it. I will then become a straight up user of Bitcoin as opposed to user and speculator like we are today. Right now, we're both users and speculators. Yes. Some people are just speculators and some people are just users. If Bitcoin does get knocked out by another coin, which neither one of us thinks is going to happen, but if it does, you will only see the original Bitcoin speculators become users of whatever token wins, and we might have to wait 3 to 4 years.
Fully agree with that. And on that point, there's very few uses for cryptocurrency. And all of those uses, it would appear in non-ideological terms, have all centered around Bitcoin time and time and time again.
You know what? Since you mentioned uses, let's jump onto uses. Well, I was going to talk about this a little bit later, but let's take a look at it now. I'm just going to do a quick screen share, and we're going to skip ahead and talk about uses. So this was an article I wrote probably over a year ago. What does it look like? April 4th, 2016. So close to a year ago. And I talked about my top use cases of cryptocurrencies, and they all have to do with bearer assets. And when I wrote it, some of them were just starting to pick up. So we are doing a screen share so everyone can see these. So which of these actually interests you the most? And I'm gonna mention all of them because for the audio people that aren't looking at the video, we have donating to causes that the governments may not approve of, like WikiLeaks. We have buying goods that governments don't necessarily approve of, like the drug market. Gambling is a very good use case for Bitcoin because of its bearer properties. We've already seen it used on things like Backpage for escort services. The one I threw in here was kind of if you're going to get married, and some people are afraid to lose a lot of their assets after a failed marriage, this can allow them to hide some of those assets ahead of time. Kind of throw that one in there for fun. Of course, the governments hate the fact that Bitcoin could be used to avoid taxes. And my favorite use case is the transfer of value cross-border, because in times of stress and during war, the governments really double down on those use cases. The one that isn't on my list is Cryptolocker and things like Purse.io. And we can talk about them after, but what do you think of my initial list of 7, and did I miss anything?
Yeah, no, I think you've covered almost everything that is large in the space. There's some incidentals like notarization, which I'm not particularly interested in general, but at the top of the list, remitting value independent of financial controls. I think both in the terms of donating to causes, buying goods and services which are otherwise censored. Those are probably the key points to me in blockchain, certainly in Bitcoin, and what I find to be the most interesting above all else. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Should I go into that more?
Go into a little bit because I'm actually separating them. The reason why I separate the way you transfer value is that for one person wanting to donate to some cause, across the border permissionless is a little different for a person moving that money within himself across border. So I wanted to separate those a little bit. Not everyone has this ideological view that I need to support WikiLeaks, but I want to move from Europe to another country, and I want to take my money with me without dealing with capital controls. We might be seeing that out of China these days.
So quickly, what interests me about these for specific uses the most is that you see specialization of labor happening in ways we've never seen before, number one. And that means that people are becoming very good at weird things that no one's ever been able to componentize into its parts. So, I mean, at some level, that becomes the dark market. You have people that are specialized in everything from weird chemical manufacturers to routing value over corridors that are never been accessible before. Things like Amazon cards to paper cash. You have stories from these fronts that I think are just phenomenal stories. They're stories of risk and settlement. They're stories of just the Wild West that I find to be frankly, I find to be like rather American in spirit. You know, you think of these sort of great adventurers and these risk takers and such, and that is very entertaining for me. It keeps things fun for me, and I think these are wonderful stories to begin with. But I also think that expansion of service to the underserved is itself a really cool thing. You haven't seen a lot of people who have been so restricted from service now so enabled with service before in their fields. And so you're seeing all kinds of cool stuff as a result of that. You see these sort of cash money businesses on the internet enabling people in other countries, you know, maybe the slums of Brazil, to provide services to wealthy companies or other sort of blighted areas in ways that were never accessible. So I think that like that's very exciting. I think one last component is I'm a big fan of EMH. We won't get into that here.
No, not in this. We'll do another one for that.
But what is very interesting about Bitcoin is that you now have the ability as an investor to receive exposure to industries that had never had exposure available to you, the investor, prior. And at some level, that should actually increase the wealth for everybody. We think. Who knows? Maybe, you know, the externalities.
And I actually agree with that. I am a believer in EMH. I just also believe that there are people, and these people correspond to maybe 2% or less of investors and traders, that if it wasn't for these people, you wouldn't have EMH. And everyone tries to be that 2% that can invest better than the average, and 98% of those people fail. But I do think that 2% succeed. They may not succeed their entire life, but they succeed long enough to have better returns. And those people are few and far between. But again, that's a
much longer series of videos.
That's a discussion for another day. So let's stick to use cases for another minute. So there's two things on there. One of them is Cryptolocker. Can we talk about how Cryptolocker is affecting this industry? And the reason it wasn't on my list of Bitcoin use cases is because the 7 use cases that I've named, I see those use cases as being sometimes they're legal, sometimes they're illegal. There can be a real debate about that. I didn't want to add Cryptolocker on that list because it's hard for me to argue the moral goodness in Cryptolocker. And maybe Chris will have a counterpoint to that.
I'm the worst person in the world to explain moral goodness, but what I will say that I do like about ransomware is it does make Windows computers more secure. And while that sounds obtuse, you can certainly see that security across the board is improving for most consumer goods. We've certainly seen that on phones, of which I think very few to none have ever seen ransomware. I think there's a lot of people who have been saying for years that the computer industry has these vulnerabilities, but without specialization of labor, it's never been an issue. Nonetheless, these vulnerabilities pre-existed the ransomware that occurred recently. So you had things like large government agencies that were able to come in, infect your computers because there was no vibrant economy that allowed for the specialization of labor to actually improve these products. But now with ransomware, we're seeing that happen. You're seeing either consumers no longer use Windows products because they recognize that there's a security issue, or you're seeing products in Windows get better as a result of users who had their data compromised. So whether it's moral or not, you be the judge, but the net outcome of this, I would expect, would be greater security for everyone.
Yeah, and I will add to that, I guess, Cryptolocker is just one ransomware program. There is probably about 30 others that I've taken a look. They're all competing with each other, and they're mostly these days competing on customer service. So I heard they have some of the best, most friendly customer service in the business. So they might actually be pioneering on that end as well.
Well, which, by the way, in many cases I've heard are like kids in the slums of Brazil who are, for the first time in their life, able to do customer service. So like, it's weird. I get that it's freaking weird, but this is Bitcoin. And you know what? It's giving some money to these kids who, again, are improving the security of your computers. It's Bitcoin. Don't ask me.
All right. So, we'll get to future use cases of Bitcoin. In our last section is how we see the future of Bitcoin. So right now, also on the current use, can we also talk about how we've seen the view of Bitcoin from the government's perspective and from the user's perspective? Because I'm agreeing with you, and we've had these discussions in the past. Back in the 2013 days, all we wanted was for the government to recognize Bitcoin as legit money. And today it feels like that's the last thing we want. You want to comment on that?
Is. Well, I encourage everyone to walk away from this discussion with, if nothing else, the fact that Bitcoin is not money. It is, in fact, a naturally occurring beanie baby. Tell your lawmakers that there's nothing else going on here that'll help us all out. But yeah, when I first came here, I was all about Bitcoin as money. And what I didn't realize was what a loaded set of conditions that brought to us. You know, Bitcoin will, whatever the government classifies Bitcoin as, Bitcoin will do its own thing. The honey badger of money, I don't think cares. The government, I think, sees it in a couple of different ways. We see the IRS taking Bitcoin more seriously, and for me, I don't really care that much about like income tax fraud or avoidance. It's never been my thing. I personally believe it's your patriotic duty to pay your taxes, and another series of videos could be why that might actually be in your interest. But that incidental, I do think that the federal government is taking more of a tax compliance interest in Bitcoin. I think that there is a degree of legitimization at some level at the federal government level of cryptocurrencies, then seeing that it at least is a revenue source for them theoretically. But at the same time, you see like the DEA having a hell of a time with the specialization of labor that's occurring. And that's been very notable in South Florida, both in Flocka as well as fentanyl's performance on the streets. So it gives them challenges. And, you know, every agency is somewhere in between. We even have like Delaware at some level that is conceptually at least exploring it for blockchain technology, for whatever the hell that might mean, for their own projects. So, you know, governments are kind of like companies. There's many of them. And at many levels, they have many different opinions. But the most important ones are generally those dealing with, I think, taxes. No surprise there. In the case of Bitcoin, public crime of various kinds. And they see it as like here to stay. So we'll see what ends up happening in those fields.
Right. And I agree with that. I just have a slightly different view. When Chris said that it's your patriotic duty to pay your taxes, that is a good quote, but I've been going with a slightly different quote, though a little bit similar. And my view is it's your patriotic duty to pay the least amount of taxes you can legally get away with. And that maybe gives me a little bit more of a cover in that I see a lot of our tax revenue used for things I don't really like. So to me, it's your patriotic duty to pay the least amount of taxes you can actually get away with. So on that note, since you mentioned blockchain, let's, and again, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull up the very first time the word blockchain appears to have been mentioned by Satoshi in a comment to his code. And maybe you can talk about that. As again, I'm doing a screen share right now for a live audience, and maybe you can just read it.
Well, this could be a very expansive discussion in full, but I believe that this is what a blockchain is. And I'll read to you what Satoshi wrote. This was first evidenced in the main.h file of the code that was, I think that this particular segment is actually from the release in January of 2009. Prior to this, incidentally, there wasn't a mention of blockchain in the code. It was originally called a time chain, which is interesting. But the word blockchain, I think, started to go around the mailing list prior to the release. And at some point between the conception in Satoshi's mind and the January 5th date, I think, or 3rd date, this code was released with the word blockchain. So yeah, Satoshi defined this very centrally as a proof of work system. And as you see, nodes collect new transactions into a block, hash them into a hash tree, and scan through nonce values to make the block's hash satisfy proof of work requirements. When they sought the proof of work, they broadcast the block to everyone, and the block is added to the blockchain. The first transaction in the block is a special one that creates a new coin owned by the creator of the block. Well, those benign words have come really, I think, to haunt a lot of people in the blockchain movement. So much so that they've tried very hard and aggressively to sweep that definition under the rug to suit them in basically pitching snake oil. So that itself has been an interesting phenomenon.
And I've also had discussions with regulators, and the first thing I tell them, you have to find out what the person means by blockchain. I don't care if that's 80% of the time you spend. Today, the word blockchain has been, to me, I agree with you. To me, you need proof of work to be a blockchain. It needs to have a bearer component in the digital economy. And if it's not, I don't really see how it is a blockchain, or at the least it's not innovative. So what I've been saying for probably close to a year now, the word blockchain has become so convoluted that on one end, it's proof of work bearer instrument like Bitcoin, and on the other end, it's an Excel spreadsheet posted as a Google Doc. And they both mean blockchain today, in my opinion.
Yeah, and it seems to me.
And one may require regulation over the other, but you have to know what you're talking about. And I always break it back down to that discussion. Where on the spectrum are you between the two?
Well, I believe that the blockchain is the Satoshi blockchain. I don't see any. I believe that the word is morphed to mean anything that you want, anything that you want. But for me, when I use the word blockchain, it requires proof of work. And I would encourage you in this series to ask most of your guests what a blockchain is, because it's hard to have a really good conversation in this space without an operational definition of the word.
Oh, absolutely. When we get into some of these other topics. All right, so the last topic for what is happening with the system now, and this really, really bothers me, and I know you've heard it a lot. Now, again, the Bitcoin may or may not be a scam. We're leaning towards probably not.
I'm leaning towards not.
Leaning towards not, but in the beginning, yes, there were aspects we weren't sure in the beginning. You joined way before I did. I wasn't too skeptical of Bitcoin. I just didn't find it as interesting as I did when I eventually jumped in. But what I hear very, very often, and the moment I hear this buzzword, it always bothers me. It's like, well, we're introducing people to the crypto economy and Bitcoin through our token. And why is that? Why do people always talk about Bitcoin in relation to their token when selling their token?
Well, I mean, they want to piggyback on the success of Bitcoin. And, you know, there's so many scams in the space. Affinity scams are one classification of scams. Usually an affinity scam is when a person comes into a room and uses their credentials to extract value out of their reputational network. But I think that in a similar way, using the word Bitcoin is a bit of an affinity scam in the sense that you take the reputational value of Bitcoin and you use it to peddle other products. Now, I will say I first heard about Bitcoin in 2010. There was a Slashdot article. I saw it. I said, this is interesting, but there's no chance in hell it's going to work. I was skeptical about it.
In what context was the article?
You can look it up. It's like a very famous event on the Bitcoin spectrum of news. But the context was, I think, an introductory post by like Rob or Commander Taco or one of those guys. And I looked at it, and it wasn't like a news event had happened. It was like a show and tell kind of thing for the Slashdot group. There were actually two of them. And when I saw that, I looked into it for a little bit, and I thought to myself, this will never work, but cool idea. And I wouldn't have told you this then, but what's obvious to me now is that I didn't realize this was interesting until roughly February, March of 2011. At that time, Silk Road had come out, and I saw somebody who was routing value indiscriminately, solving problems that were unsolvable in incumbent systems. And at that time, I saw a utility to this thing, a non-speculative utility. And it was then that I started to find this very, very interesting. When you see a lot of these projects, for me, they're just Ponzi's until they have a utility, until they solve a problem that can only be solved using that implementation and that solution. They're completely speculative based. And I would still apply that same rubric to them. They are maybe at best interesting, but not solid investments and probably scams. Really.
Right, and I'm going to mention how I first heard of Bitcoin. And I heard of Bitcoin probably around the same time. I don't remember the exact date. I can probably go back and find it. It was either in very, very late 2010 or very, very early 2011. And the way I heard about it was at the time, I was a big fan of RT and watching shows like Capital Account and Max Kaiser. And I clearly remember Max Kaiser talking about Bitcoin and WikiLeaks looking to accept it as donations because they were running out of money due to the ban of traditional value routing. And this is when WikiLeaks was releasing all that evidence on the Iraq war and some of the other stuff. And I thought that was a very interesting concept, that they can accept a method of payment for donations that isn't controlled by the government. Of course, I didn't do anything with that information, and I finally got into Bitcoin in 2013, but that is what raised my interest. And I didn't even know about Silk Road till 2012. So I wasn't even aware of that side of the economy. But I was also on Wall Street working 12-hour days, so I didn't really have time to look into that other stuff, just as a background history on that.
Well, I mean, it's a similar story, frankly. What got us in might have differed, but what was interesting to both of us was a non-speculative use case.
Correct. And then it turns into that. All right, so now let's turn this discussion into where we think Bitcoin might be headed in the future. And of course, we have to talk about the concept of scaling and potential mass adoption. And there is a big scaling debate going on, something for probably future episodes. But in a conceptual way, do you think it's possible for Bitcoin to scale and accommodate not necessarily the size of the current payment system, but at least, let's say, take over 20% of the global payment systems with Bitcoin?
I don't think on-chain scaling is possible at those levels, and I think that that's a consensus view. It's a lot of arguing going on about this. That being said, I think that off-chain systems for reconciliation will make that very possible. I think it's possible already to do that, but I think that the risk reduction will be improved over time, such that we'll see off-chain scaling systems become more and more mainstream.
And just not to get into the topic, but are you a fan of SegWit, and do you think that is a decent way to go forward?
Yeah, I'm a fan of SegWit. For me, the block size is very uninteresting. I recognize it's a gigantic debate. I'm not so talented that I could tell you anything you haven't heard already. What I like the most about SegWit is the transaction malleability fixes, which is esoteric, but as a programmer, extremely useful.
And can you just define what the transaction malleability problem is and how bad is it?
Yeah, there's a Bitcoin transaction needs to be signed off in order for it to be entered into the network. And once it's signed, it is a immutable set of data. However, the configuration of that data is such that the hash of it can change. The transaction ID can change. So even though you may have entered into the network with instructions and a hash of, let's say 10, it could end up reflected into the final state of the network with a hash of, say, 11. It's a very simple idea. That is probably, or even certainly, a bug at this point, and the ramifications of that are such that it makes everyone's lives very difficult. One of the theoretical ways that even Mt. Gox ended up losing out on a lot of money was because of that bug. It's been kind of rebutted since, but it's nonetheless a major source of friction. So for that alone, I'm a major fan of SegWit. That being said, I don't know that the block size itself is as attractive to me, though it's fine. There's nothing really so bad about it.
All right, so again, one more topic that people like to criticize Bitcoin of and call Bitcoin a problem and a potential scam is this mining centralization concept. And right now on the screen, for those watching it on video, we have the hash rate, which continues to go up. And the interesting is, I was a newbie in Bitcoin, attending my first meetings in like 2013 at the Bitcoin Center in New York. And I clearly remember like a professor in cryptography talking about Bitcoin and how in September of 2013, it was going to have these major problems because the hash rate is unsustainable and there isn't enough power, and it's going to go the way of Dogecoin. And I knew very little about the subject, and I just remember laughing, saying, if that was true, why are so many people dying to invest in mining? It just didn't, and I was so new to it, and I didn't get it. So what do you see as a potential problem for Bitcoin with this questionable mining centralization happening in China? And is the continued increase of the hash rate problematic?
Well, so like I'm sympathetic to the argument that mining is centralized and that represents risk. But I think that all of those statements are always expressed without consideration of the opportunity costs of non-centralized networks. In an environment where the mining was perfectly distributed throughout the entire world, but energy was nonetheless cheaper in China, now we would have systemic risk by an attacker in that they could move to China and they can displace out non-centralized users. So this is a reflection of the state of nature. This is just the way the universe is configured. You can come to me and you can tell me that, okay, we want CPU-based mining, and I'm sympathetic to that. But the problem with that is that the opportunity cost of CPU-based mining is now your mining costs are effectively subsidized by Microsoft, in that an attacker can come and issue a botnet that would then attack the network. And the major problem with CPU-based mining then is that the entirety of your costs for mining are fixed costs and not variable costs. So like the criticism is there, but very rarely is there a better way to do things than what we have now from what I see in the debate. And if miner centralization does reflect an aggregate systemic risk to Bitcoin, then all of blockchain fails. And that's okay to me. I'm here having a very wonderful academic time observing the network and seeing what happens. But don't come to me and tell me you've got something figured out. That's the part of it that I resent. You can say that it's bad, and I'm sympathetic to it. Thus far, like you said, nothing's really materialized out of it. So I don't know. It is what it is.
Well, there's some very specific criticisms of mining. One of them is if mining is currently centralized in China, and I don't believe that it's really centralized in China. The second or third biggest mining pool is Bitfury. And I think at least I believe, and I think you would second me, that Bitfury may be playing possum a little bit, and they actually could have more hashing power if they wanted to. But they're trying to stay under the radar because they're not in China and they are trying to distribute their network. What do you think about that?
Well, I haven't done the calculations recently, but generally what you'll find is that like 90% of the cost of a Bitcoin's seniorage rate is energy costs. So I think for a lot of these distributorships, they have a throttle, and they point that throttle at whatever degree is profitable for them. So maybe throttle at 40% is what's profitable. Maybe a throttle at 100% is what's profitable. The fixed costs go out, the miners go out, and they come back, manufacture. They just start burning up that energy as fast as they can. But what they'll find is that the market is seeking some rate of equilibrium on that seniorage cost. So I don't know. Like I certainly believe that these places can burn more. I think that they're in some degree of equilibrium currently, and I don't know that there's really a lot of truth to that being even an issue should they, increase that throttle. The other thing too I will say about a lot of this debate is that like it's easy for us in this English-speaking channel as Americans to say that Chinese miners have an undue influence. But in China, what they have is a Chinese-speaking channel where they're saying that the English programmers have an undue influence. And for me, that's a sign of a system that is in equilibrium. You have a check and a balance, and my suspicion is it's working fairly well.
That is a very good point. Now, one more criticism is because there is a view that there is a centralization of mining in China. Whether that's true or not, that's the view, at least here on this side of the world. And well, what if Chinese government just shows up at most of these mining facilities all at once and confiscates equipment or basically shuts down the operation? What kind of an effect can that have on Bitcoin, and is something like that feasible or should be a concern?
Well, if that happens at some time in less than about 2016 blocks, maybe a little bit more actually, the network will recalibrate to difficulty and things will chug onwards. My suspicion is that these places whose throttle are at 20% in the States or in non-Chinese countries will then go to 80% in those places. And we will quickly see that the network performance does snap back towards where it was. And don't forget that the basis vector of all mining operations is in fact exponential. So it'll be within a degree of magnitude of the mining energy in very little time, mostly due to the efficiencies of Moore's law. So I'm less concerned by that. They could definitely do some kind of denial of service, but the denial of service may be really benign. It could just end up being that confirmations are like 20 minutes instead of 10. That's what I would easily see happening, which would suck.
Okay, so another general concern, I get this a lot from major Bitcoin critics, and we do want to address their issues. So one of the concerns that I get is, actually there's a few of them. One of them is Bitcoin doesn't have anything backing it, and you can't hold it in your hand. There's no intrinsic value to Bitcoin, and a lot of people see that as a negative. I happen to see it as a positive when I say, well, there's nothing to hold, there's nothing the government can confiscate. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, the first thing I'd say is that what makes Bitcoiners very unique generally is that they love criticism at this age. Like for me, the critics are the best people to talk to. They're the people who will expand my thinking. And if I'm wrong about something, I need to know first. That is very unlike most of the other coins in the space, where critics are quickly dismissed from their communities because they are less interested in pursuing science. Now, as far as intrinsic value is concerned, Bitcoin does have an intrinsic value to me in that it is a persistence of data that is immutable. That may be very incidental to the needs of people or the sort of utilitarian aspects of a blockchain. That's another conversation. What is more important is it's used for the exchange of goods and services. And I think that if there's any lesson to be learned in money since when was the Federal Reserve created? The early part of the 20th century. Yeah, the early part of the 20th century. It's that intrinsic value probably isn't that important, and we at least have some significant degree of performance data on that, and you may or may not agree with that. But for me, intrinsic value went out the window when we started progressing past that.
No, and I generally agree with that. And so let's talk about another thing. Another criticism of a lot of Bitcoin skeptics is, well, what happens when the internet goes down? How good are your Bitcoins?
Well, the Bitcoins are perfectly fine because the work has been done. And by the way, this is one of the reasons why proof of work is interesting and proof of stake is not. That work has been put into that confirmation, into that settlement, and that isn't changing. You may not be able to spend it as easily, but you can do a lot even without internet access. You can present bonds. Double spending is an issue, but there are many models of Bitcoin by which internet access is incidentally important. And it's just, again, the modern world is such that we assess these risks when we do transactions. You can also transact with credit cards when the internet's down, and it's clunky and it's weird. And we either settle for that when we have to, or we don't use credit cards at that point.
Well, I take that argument to a slightly different direction, and I just say, well, if the internet goes down for any significant amount of time, nothing else will work either.
And that's
Bitcoin
also
will
very
be
true.
your last problem because your bank isn't going to work. Like how good are those credit cards? How good is your bank? How are you going to pay your bills? I don't know how I'm going to pay my bills without my bank account, without the internet to log on to my bank. So of course these are first world problems versus third world problems. But in the first world, without internet, you have huge problems. And when I explain this to people, I'm like, well, what would you do without internet? And then they take it one step further. Oh, well, what if there's no electricity? You know, because this is mostly coming from gold bugs. What if there's no electricity? And I have a very easy argument to that. And my answer to that is, well, with 1,000+ nuclear power facilities around the world, a global electricity outage for over 2 weeks will lead to over 1,000 meltdowns, like 1,000 Fukushimas happening all at once, and you're looking at a 98% reduction in population. Again, Bitcoin, not your gold will be the last of your worries under a catastrophic scenario of no electricity for over a 2-week span globally, and people don't really think about that or acknowledge that. And I tell them, so unless you're a prepper with a bunker, you're probably going to die.
Well, I mean, that's an old argument. We've had this when credit cards came out, and carbon copy machines still exist. Now, I think that with the chip and pin, we're only now starting to remove those, but that debate was settled, I think, at that time. And for anybody who's old enough to remember, there was a time when credit cards were effectively copied by way of this hokey machine that you use to facilitate a quick carbon copy of the card. So there's nothing new about that debate. That's a debate that applies to electronic payment mechanisms, not Bitcoin. And we've already weighed in, like consumers love electronic payment.
Right. All right, so let's get into, we're going to close this out with a very important topic. Let's talk about how the laws are going to affect Bitcoin going forward. And this is how I kind of phrase this debate. And again, this is where a lot of your values change, whether you are a speculator of Bitcoin or you're not. It's like both of us were probably big fans of legalization of drugs because it's better for society. But now that we're also Bitcoin speculators a little bit, is that something we really want these days, the legalization of drugs? Because if we can use our credit cards or cash for drugs, what does that do to Bitcoin?
This is the most controversial part of this show. Get ready. So here's the thing about Bitcoin. We need at least one kind of non-speculative capital inflow in order for this thing to work. So capital inflow is when consumers put money into a asset class, in this case Bitcoin, and they put it in there to park that value there. Now, there's the speculative capital, which we've covered already. It's very Ponzi-like typically. Then there's the non-speculative capital inflow. Non-speculative capital inflow requires some degree of regulatory support, as I see it. That regulatory support comes in the form of regulations which censor transactions from using all other payment mechanisms but Bitcoin. So when you have like people buying drugs with Bitcoin, what that means is there's now capital inflows that are mandated by a federal government into the system. People are using it not because they want to be there, but because they have to be there. Those regulations matter in my view of this model. And for me, we can't really have a functioning Bitcoin without things like illegal drugs, without things like onerous capital flight restrictions, without things like Backpage, and without things like ransomware. You know, it's very difficult to have this conversation with somebody who wants to have like a moral or ethical view on it. I'm sympathetic to what their views are. I can get into a longer discussion on why those are just cultural views. For me, at an academic level, they're just kind of irrelevant. Finance is finance. Capital inflows have to exist. So in terms of what laws we need, weirdly enough, we need stricter immigration. We need more drugs to be illegal. We need capital controls to be tightened up. And really the biggest one that I'm really hoping that we get is the end of paper cash. I want the Federal Reserve to make paper cash illegal. And we see that happening, by the way, in India currently. And that is a huge surge of federally mandated capital inflows into the Bitcoin system by way of restricting bills larger than $20, as we've seen in 2016.
Yeah, that's been my biggest one. Like before I got into Bitcoin, I was a huge advocate of the elimination of cash would be the worst thing in the world. I'm in Bitcoin. Oh my God, the elimination of cash would be the greatest thing that ever happened for us as Bitcoiners. So this is a very interesting dynamic. So to follow up, because I have listened to your work in the past, does the government force you to use Bitcoin? Absolutely, it does. Like I'm about to do some of my own content here, and the playoffs are coming. I'd love to pay for some of my bets in Visa. I can't use Visa, so that means I have to use what I'm permitted to use, which by way of regulatory enforcement would be Bitcoin. And to add to that, that is actually one of the reasons that I got off my butt and bought my first Bitcoin for the first time, and it was 2013. And I am a New Yorker, but I went to college in Florida. I went to FSU, go Noles, and the Seminoles were supposed to have a really good 2013 season, and I wanted to place some bets. I wanted to place the bets on the college football team where I went to college. And the only way I was able to do that was by going out and getting Bitcoin. So that was my initial use case that finally got me to get Bitcoin. After I then reminded myself why I stopped betting, because I am very terrible at gambling. And as I was watching Bitcoin go up in 2013, the Bitcoin that I bought for gambling purposes, and after I realized how much I lost in gambling, now that the Bitcoin price doubled a month later, I had stopped gambling, and I haven't gambled since. But I was so happy that the government laws that prevented me from gambling got me into Bitcoin in early 2013 to bet on the Seminoles, which ended up winning the championship that year. So just a shout out.
There we go.
So, all right. So on that note, with those laws, another thing that I used to say was, people before the presidential election, people asked me, how is that presidential election going to affect the price of Bitcoin or the economy of Bitcoin? And my answer to that was very interesting. It was, no matter which candidate wins, Trump or Hillary, they will probably both be good for Bitcoin, but in different ways. Trump wants to lower taxes, but he's very anti-illegal drugs. So he will continue the drug subsidy to keep Bitcoin alive, but he will remove the tax dodging subsidy for Bitcoin. While Hillary would have been the other way around, as a Democrat, as someone that would have been raising taxes, Bitcoin would have had a better use case under Hillary for that potential tax evasion purpose, while she would be more open to legalizing the drug angle. So I don't know if you have anything to add on that.
Donald Trump also talked about restricting remittance flow to Mexico. So I was very excited by that subsidy. Now, I think he might have actually reneged on that now. It's a little up in the air still. That might be his first campaign promise that he broke to me, at least, which would be disappointing. I very much wanted him to mandate the use of Bitcoin for remittances between the U.S. and Mexico. We'll see if that happens, but that would be the other one that I remember that was out there.
All right, so we're going to close this out on a note. With the last question, we're both going to brainstorm. So what worries you? What is scaring you in the next, let's say, 5 to 10 years that could fragment Bitcoin or could make Bitcoin go away? Because a global consortium of governments legalizing all these illegal things aren't happening. Right. So I don't see that one. So what does worry you that could potentially make us look like complete idiots to our family and friends, and everyone being right that Bitcoin was a scam and it was a Ponzi and we were so wrong?
I don't mind being an idiot, not to my family and certainly not to my friends. So that isn't fun. But what does worry about me about the Bitcoin as an investment? Drugs are being legalized at an increasing pace. We see this,
which didn't bother you before Bitcoin.
No, now it bothers me. Now it definitely bothers me. Yeah, Bitcoin does that to people. The legalization of marijuana, even in my home state, was a major disappointment. In Florida, I wanted marijuana to be illegal. Unfortunately, it seems like it won't be, and I think that trend is going to continue. I think we'll probably see more drugs being legalized over time, which is very disappointing to me. I'm a very big advocate for keeping those illegal. In addition to that, I think that Roger Ver, I actually consider him a friend, and I like Roger Ver.
I agree.
But he represents this weird systemic risk in that he's trying very hard to fork the chain, and he has enough liquidity to be a bit of a problem. So he is somebody who, despite having a good relationship with, worries me. And that is another source of systemic risk, I think, to Bitcoin, and that he may, through his own incompetence or misdirection of values, sabotage a lot of the efforts that I think were positive in the space. I don't think that would end Bitcoin, but I could see it inhibiting its growth.
Yeah, I have to agree with you on that, and I will put it in the show notes. I am a consistent guest on the Bitcoin group with Thomas Hunt, and we did a year-end review, and we went through what is the best Bitcoin project in 2016, what was the worst, we went through all these categories, and one of those categories, what is your biggest surprise of 2016? And my biggest surprise of 2016 was just Roger Ver. I did not see that coming.
Neither did I. It was a bit of a disappointment. I've talked to him many times. He knows how I feel, and we'll see what ends up happening. You know, a lot of the worst parts are behind us. I will say that. I mean, back in the early part of 2016, things were looking rough, and we have a lot more consensus now, particularly after the Dow. One thing I do like about these altcoins is that they do provide lessons for the greater community to learn from. So,
but
the Dow is one of
those. Does it feel like they're not learning from them?
Well, you know what? I would have agreed with you, but I really think that, like, seeing what happened with the Dow, the momentum behind Turing complete smart contracts is dying. I'm not a believer in that. I also think that the ability for a lot of the RBTC crowd to say that hard forks are, you know, not a big deal, that's going to the wayside as well. So by and large, no, people aren't learning, but there are at least 2 occurrences where I think that people are learning. Stay tuned. We'll find out if those lessons have been learned in 2017.
Yeah, no, and I pretty much second that. I'm trying to think of another giant systemic risk to the Bitcoin community. The one that I see going further down the line, just being the student of economics and history, there are these periods, even in the US history, we've had multiple periods of no central bank, and then the central bank comes in. So playing devil's advocate in those terms, and a lot of people see the Federal Reserve as evil because they control the monetary policy. And again, that is a much longer discussion whether they are or aren't, but we are in agreement that the Federal Reserve and the Treasury have control of the US economy and value and money, right? So my view is eventually there are these crashes in every economic system. So maybe in 10, 20 years down the line, there is some kind of a major economic catastrophe in Bitcoin. And enough people start screaming, somebody needs to do something. And then the community comes to an agreement, well, maybe we do need a group of people that will decide this inflation rate. And the community may be okay with it, maybe it would be coerced into it. So that to me is a future systemic risk, that something like this could be taken over with people allowing, people want to be ruled by someone. They always want oracles, and they want to go to these oracles. Now, another potential issue that I see is, it always worries me the mood of our current core dev team and people helping the core dev team. And I remember there was earlier in 2016 when Gregory Maxwell took a break because he was getting some death threats. And I find that to be very problematic. And that worries me, and I believe I publicly said that if our current dev team, the core dev team, rage quits, that would probably cause me to leave Bitcoin.
Well, I am not. I get that concern. I'm not, in the scheme of things, I'm not as concerned about those. One I will add, though, that is a sort of tangential concern. I think that the block subsidies are running low. We all know this. They're not running low in the sense to worry about it this year or next year, but in the coming years, they're getting lower and lower. And meanwhile, what we don't see is that tips are matching the displacement in those subsidies. So at some point, we need to hit parity there, meaning transaction costs need to go up. And that is maybe something that is out there.
Not necessarily, and here's the counter to that. And this goes back to how this podcast started, in that the world economy is adjusting to Bitcoin and its subsidies and its predictable halving period. So the tips don't necessarily have to go up quickly. It's possible that the price of Bitcoin will go up into the next halving.
That's certainly true.
To have a smoother transition. And the world has 4 years of predictability, 3.5 now, to adjust to that.
That is certainly true.
Which is why it doesn't scare me as much yet.
Yes, yet is the key word. Yes, and I'm with you.
What scares me more is our current core dev team, because I do trust them. Maybe it's blind trust, because I do believe they got us this far. And I think their view of the world and on privacy and security is very, very important. Your programmer needs to have the right mental state, is probably as important, if not more so today, than his actual coding ability. He needs to have the right mind frame to code what he's doing for the right reasons. And to me, that's important. So if all of a sudden there's a crackdown where a lot of our core devs, God forbid, get arrested by the government, and people are scared to code, the right people are scared to code for Bitcoin, we will have the incompetent developers coding for Bitcoin, and not necessarily their programming ability is incompetent. Their mental view on the privacy and security aspect and fungibility aspect of Bitcoin is incompetent.
And anonymous internet programmers have defined Bitcoin since the beginning, and they will be a part of Bitcoin for the foreseeable future. And if there is a world where it is legal to express certain code, you know, that's a weird world. I don't know what will happen there, but what I can guess is they will have a return to the anonymous internet programmer, because this is a highly motivating project, I think, for very competent people. And I think for a lot of the programmers that have put their whole lives into this project, I don't think they would be so quickly discouraged. And even in the face of an aggressor, I could see them being even a bit encouraged that what they're doing is mattering. So it could go both ways.
That's good. All right. I'm so sorry for closing on such a pessimistic note, but we're both huge believers of Bitcoin. Absolutely. But again, this is a new series called CryptoScam, where we'll examine a lot of the projects and specifically the tokens in the crypto space. I'm Tone Vase. You can find me. I have a YouTube channel, Talking Economics. I'm also a regular on the World Crypto Network. My blog is Liberty Life Trail, with all the links being below. Join us on our next show, where we will talk about the second highest token with the second highest market cap. And of course, we all know that to be OneCoin. So please watch the episode 2, and we will discuss the profile and the legitimacy of OneCoin. Chris?
I'm Chris DeRose. I am the nefarious co-host of Bitcoin Uncensored. You can reach me at DeRose Tech on Twitter or Brighton36 on Telegram. And I always love hearing your comments, your criticisms, and even on occasion your compliments. But don't give me too many of those. Chunking up the deuce of the South. See you later, party people.